faults, and we're going to try and clear up some of that stuff today. Plus, we're going to go and talk about the actual examination part as well. So I just wanted to mention that I was a part of a member of Troop 151 Girl Scouts in Burbank back in the, oh gosh, let me see, early 60s, but we don't need to mention that. But Girl Scouts is always, in fact, back then, they had do they still have campfire girls? Girls, they're the rivals, you know. But anyway, we had a good time. We had a good time, and we only had a couple of different kinds of cookies to sell back then. Now you have a lot of good ones. So what I am is a registered nurse, as Sela said, and the designation is SANE, which stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. The attributes of any nurse, specifically a forensic nurse, are to be objective. That's one of the things that we hold over a lot of the other participants in the project. In other words, there's the SART, which you will hear about, which is the Sexual Assault Response Team. And that involves the sexual assault nurse examiner, the advocate, law enforcement, the district attorney, and the forensic sciences. So that's a whole team of people. So when I'm doing an examination, they're not all there. It's just me. So we call it the SANE exam, but you can hear it referred to as the SART exam as well. And as a nurse, of course, I don't judge my patients as they come through the door with their coughs and colds and injuries. So that's the same with forensic nursing, although there may be maybe an inclination to do that. So objectivity, number one, we have an unbiased evaluation of our patients. Some of them may have injuries of body and anogenital areas, and some of them may not. So we want to evaluate, and if we do see an injury, we don't jump immediately to the conclusion that this was related to a sexual assault. We're going to adhere to standards of care for nursing, accurate, competent, and ethical evaluation of findings, and we're going to apply the scope and standards of forensic nursing practice. Evidence-based practice, of course, is utmost. We don't have a patient just make a decision and tell law enforcement that we made a verdict. So we have to use evidence-based practice. Objectivity, what is that? If the forensic nurse examiner thinks it's his or her job to help the reported victims and get the bad guy, we're probably in the wrong field. The reason is that you've come in with a prejudged attitude that everybody that comes into you has been sexually assaulted, and that everybody who accuses somebody is a bad guy or a bad woman. And we want to make sure that we stay objective. That keeps us on track and prevents us from being judgmental or applying any kind of false facts. Now, in today's world, there's a lot of different names for that. So we're going to do exams on reported victims. They're usually designated with the V inside of the parenthesis, but that says victim. And I don't know at this point in time if they're actually a victim. So right now they're a reported victim, and we do exams on suspects as well. Both of them are our patients. What we won't do is the same kind of interview with the suspect, because that might be interfering with police business and their Miranda rights. So I'm going to ask them about their medical history and maybe a few other questions regarding their behavior, but I don't want their whole story about what happened. I want the law enforcement officers to take that. So I'm a nurse first. A lot of people jump into forensic nursing and thinking, oh boy, I'm a forensic person now, but don't forget that we're nurses. So we're assessing our patients primarily for medical, social, family, domestic, psychological, and physiological issues. That's called biopsychosocial. And the reason being is that we may be able to assist in some other way if we know a little bit more about this patient's life. So that's what we're going to do. It's the role of the SANE to document what the patient tells and accurately, objectively describe the findings without editorializing. We're going to photograph the patient, and we're going to use a fair and accurate representation of what is observed. We'll have some examples maybe later on, but if I look at a patient and I see a scratch there, I'm going to say there's a 1-inch abrasion, and not there's a 1-inch abrasion caused by a horrible person who scratched her. So that's the difference between objectivity and making it something it's not. All right, so again, we're forensic, but we're also medical legal. And we are the link between nursing and the law, but we are not the law. And we don't see ourselves as working for or against. So in other words, I'm not a nurse cop, and the cops aren't doing my job, I don't do their job. So we're an independent entity. We are patient advocates. And the reason I'm emphasizing patient is because during this exam, we're also going to call a crisis advocate. Differentiate there. So I'm the role of the educator. I know. What? Well, because I teach other RNs. I teach medical and allied professionals. We have other persons in the medical world that we interact with. We teach the community. We go out and talk to schools, and we'll talk to people in schools and community events, Rotary clubs, whatnot, women's groups. Teaches patients. That's always part of the process, no matter what. I teach law enforcement. Back in the day when I was starting up some programs, we used to go to all the briefings. Oh, there's one at 6 a.m., there's one at noon, there's one at 5, there's one at 9. So we spent a lot of time educating the community. At the time that I started my, well, I was actually, you're out that way. I was working, I set up a program at San Gabriel Valley Medical Center. I had already worked at USC, California Hospital, and Mission Community Hospital in their sexual assault programs. So I took the best of those programs and I set up the program at San Gabriel. And I left there in 2003 to establish my own practice. But those programs, I was able to draw from all of them and pick the best parts of all of them so our program could be great. So my program was right there on Fair Oaks. And the law enforcement officers that I used to do a lot of different departments. You have a lot of different independent departments out there. And the departments were very, very responsive. And I went and talked to them and they would bring their patients to me. So we had a very good rapport. In fact, when I had my practice in Pasadena, I used to go and do DUI checkpoints with them and other kind of community events with law enforcement. So that was a very interesting thing. So if they pulled somebody over, I would draw the blood for them right there. So teaching law enforcement, I'm teaching attorneys, because what happens in this particular exam is that most of the time when medical people do things, the next person that looks at their stuff is going to be another medical person. But in this case, the next person that's going to look at my things are going to be law enforcement, followed by attorneys. And attorneys may know their job, but sometimes they don't know our job and they don't know the human body very well. And so that education is going to assist with them in presenting their case. Now, I said attorneys. So we have a prosecution attorney and we have a defense attorney. The prosecution attorney is the people, they say. And so they're going to be the ones that are going to prosecute the guy for this alleged crime. Well, I can go and talk about the examination that I've done for prosecution. I'm kind of built in, the nurses are kind of built into the prosecution's case. It doesn't mean we're always going to say something favorable for them, but that's what it goes like. And then on the defense side, maybe there's a nurse that did the exam that made some mistakes or that sort of thing. So I take a look and make sure that the exam was competently done. And juries, because once we go to court, who am I going to be talking to? Most of the time, most of the cases that I have are jury trials. Juveniles don't have juries, but most all others have jury trials. So I'll be teaching the jury about the examination and about the things that I did during the examination. So one of the things, what do you do when there's a sexual assault? Well, I was looking at another presentation earlier and I do wanted to put in, if you see something, say something. And I thought, well, that's kind of old hat now, but I thought I'd bring it up again today because sometimes that's what it is. When you see something going on in a car or some situation, it's a good thing to say, because what happens with nurses is we're mandated reporters. And if there's anything that happens to any of you, then you want to go to law enforcement and report it. It doesn't mean you have to go through a whole big deal. You have control of how you want to handle it. But we are mandated reporters. So what will happen is we'll contact law enforcement. I will contact law enforcement. I prefer you do it first, then I don't have to do it. And then law enforcement knows where their sexual assault centers are. So they will bring you to the appropriate one in your jurisdiction. That's where you would want to have your exam, is in the jurisdiction in which the alleged crime happened. So we'll contact law enforcement. Law enforcement is mandated by law to contact the advocacy center, and we are responsible by HIPAA for patient privacy. So there are a number of things that are going on there. When the patient gets to me, I can do an examination. They will sign consent for the forensic exam and then photography. And I will call the advocacy center if police haven't. I spoiled my police very much. So I would call the advocate, and we would all meet at my office, or wherever the sexual assault center is. And they will be the support person for the victim. Why? That helps me be objective. So that's why we have that person as the support person, and that would be the crisis advocate, whereas I remain the patient advocate. Down at the bottom are the penal codes for law enforcement having to call advocacy. Programs have different age groups. There's adult and adolescent programs. The adolescent and adult program is for 12 years old and up, and the child programs are under 12 years old. And you can clearly see that there's some overlapping there. So the child programs, age of consent varies from state to state. In California, it's 18, but it does vary from state to state. So if you're somewhere else, you're going to want to know what that is in your area. But age of consent may vary as far as it goes of signing for the exam. All right, so it's like if your blood alcohol is 0.08, you shouldn't drive a car, but that doesn't mean you can't communicate with me. So there's a differentiation there between what the age of consent is. So a question was, what defines puberty? And that has a lot to do with the development of the body, the physical development of the body. And so pre-puberty is any time, let's say for a female, between 1 and 2 years, maybe before the menses start, before the period starts. And that is making the body go through some changes, physical changes. And so what happens after that, when the period finally does start, we call that puberty. But pre-puberty and under 12 years old are going to go to a particular pediatric program. Some programs do all pediatric and all ages, and some don't. So we're going to have to find the right program for that person. And like I say, the law enforcement knows all about where to find these programs. There are acute and non-acute examinations. And what the definition of that is when did it happen and how far from the event. So the viability of biological evidence is going to dictate that. Now, in the beginning, we thought biological evidence was going to last maybe 72 hours. So that was the time frame for an acute exam. But through the years and the advancement of technology, especially in DNA, we're finding that the specimens that we need to look at, or they need to look at in the lab, are lasting much longer than that. So currently you're going to find an average of 5 to 7 days, but actually the current time frame is 7 to 9 days. We believe we can still collect biological evidence. A non-acute exam is the same as an examination, except we won't be collecting samples because we believe that we've passed the time where there would be viable samples. So if you come in like 2 days after the event, or even 8 or 10 days after, I'd still collect samples. But if you come in 2 weeks, 3 weeks after, I'm not expecting any biological samples to be remaining of any other person. So that would be a non-acute examination, but we would do the same thing with the evaluation. and talking to you, taking down the history of what happened. We just would not take any samples except for your own DNA, which at some point in time could be compared to foreign DNA that they might find in you. Children programs may differ again from 24, 96, 7, 8 days, and they usually have a smaller time frame in which evidence can be collected. Consent is one of the big issues. Consent cannot be determined from anogenital findings, adult and adolescent, because sometimes there are changes just from using toilet paper and the daily things that you do that can cause different findings. And consent in sexual contact looks a whole lot like non-consent. There's no way. They're the same activity. It's just a matter of whether there's a consent or not, which will not be determined by the anogenital findings. And we cannot substantiate anogenital force from the examination. These are false expectations that people think that if there are injuries, it must not be consenting. But that is not true. So the history given to the SANE, that's only one side of the story. And that's why we want to be sure not to editorialize and write it exactly as the patient told it to us. There's no such thing as a virgin check or rough sex. Now, those are two totally different things. So I'll do one at a time. A virgin check occasionally will be asked of a mother, perhaps, to bring her daughter in to see if she has had sex. That is not done. First of all, nobody can do that. Nobody knows. There's only a couple of things that would be telling whether or not there was any penetration, but we wouldn't know by who, by what, or when. That is something that will not be done by a forensic nurse. If you hear that, please let me know. But that doesn't done. So we don't do virgin checks. Rough sex is something that I hear all the time. It's brought up in court. People use that and they think that if there's injuries, there must be rough sex, but there's no clear definition of what that is. And sex or vigorous sex, however you want to describe it, that doesn't mean anything. There is no consent for underage persons. So what is important is patient health and safety, objectivity. Oh, where have I heard that before? Accurate, competent documentation without editorializing. And we want good nursing patient care and critical thinking. These exams are the same but different. And every patient that we see, every person you come into contact with is different. So you want to cater to that patient's needs and make sure that you look out for some special things for that particular patient. We need to keep up to date. There's things that we thought in the beginning and people wrote. There were articles, even in literature, that are old and invalidated now. There was once thought that this would happen and this would be a telling, some kind of a thing. Well, if there's a tear to the midline, it must be non-consensual. Well, we've learned that that's not true. And keeping up with the literature is imperative, because when you go into court, if you start spouting things that don't make sense or you just made up, that's not facts and that's not going to help anybody, whether you're working for prosecution or defense. So you want evidence-based and you want to make sure that you have the current standards. We were talking earlier about the differences in time. In the olden days, we only would collect evidence up to 72 hours. Now we collect evidence up to almost 9 days. So things change, and if you don't keep up, you're going to lose. Staying objective. Here we go again. It's really important. I've done probably more than, I don't know, I want to say 900, but probably more than that defense cases. And that's one of the things that I see over and over and over again, is the examiner sees themselves as either the representative of the patient or they want to make it appear some way. And that's one of the things that I look out for. Staying objective is not as easy as you think it is, but with practice, you can get there. It's like being a judge. You want a judge who's fair and if you have red on one, let's not use those colors. If you have pink on one side and green on the other side, if the judge clearly likes green over pink, you're not going to have an objective verdict. Okay, reality. What is reality? A great percentage percentage of reported sexual assaults involve little, if any, physical bodily injury. Probably 80% or more. They're people that know people, they know that person. Interpersonal violence, on the other hand, DV or IPV, is more bodily injury. And why is that? Because those people have a different kind of familiarity with one another or each other. And so I see more body injury, fighting, and that sort of thing among people who are involved in a very intimate way, spouses, boyfriend, girlfriend, that sort of thing. Very few patients need to go through an emergency department. I just did a review of a case a little while ago, and the patient was brought in by ambulance. And I thought, oh my gosh, now this person has a bill of, I don't know, $1,500 that they didn't need. Very, very rarely does any patient need an ambulance. They will pay for it, but that is an unnecessary need. And sometimes the ambulance company knows that too, and they charge you for it. So that was totally unnecessary, and I'm going to blow that up to the police because they shouldn't have, that shouldn't have happened. Most of the time, you're not going to see a lot of injuries. Most assaults are among people who know each other, and sometimes, I'll just bring this up now, but every once in a while, when you're talking about injuries and somebody has no injuries, they put doubt. And there's a lot of doubt anyway. Number one, we're women, and I don't know, that goes along with it too. But the fact is that they're sometimes left in a mist kind of going, what just happened? And how did I not fight? Or did I fight? Or what the problem is? There's so many different circumstances that you really can't be judging at the time. Sexual assault by a stranger is the rarest type, actually. They're the ones that jump out of the bushes. They used to list as about 5%, but there's a new, well, not anymore. There's a new classification called the brief encounter. And this was very important by Dr. Sue Lindsay that brought this up in about 2001, 2002. And what that means is that you don't really call this person an acquaintance, but you don't really know them. So this is a person you may have known for under 24 hours. Let's say you go to a party and you dance with them and that sort of thing. And then something untoward happens. And that is, would be not a stranger necessarily, but a brief encounter. The other thing I want to bring up is how easy it is to accuse somebody of sexual assault. Hello, that's all it takes, phone call. So keep in mind that sometimes people have motives for reporting a sexual assault. I don't want to pin anybody now, but you can think of things in your own head. Anger with someone, there's a number of motives. Sometimes hiding an affair can do that, but one of the things that I do as an evaluator of these cases is take into consideration what are the circumstances. And luckily, I'm not a jury, so all I need to do is bring the facts and point out a few things during the case and then let other people do that. Forensic report forms. Now that's kind of interesting. Those vary from state to state, program to program, but there usually is a basic state form somehow, somewhere. And our forms are on ccfmtc.org. That's the website for the California Clinical Forensic Medical Tech, let's see, medical, what is that, TC? Anyway, I've forgotten for one moment, I'm old, sorry. Medical Training Center, there you go, I'm not as old as I thought. Okay, so we do have the forms that we fill out, and they are helpful in a lot of ways. And what you need to do, if you have other things that you need to write, you can write an addendum. I always have a narrative that I send along with it. The adult form is an 8-page form. There are 2 child forms. There are domestic violence forms, elder abuse. You can find them all on that website, and a lot of other information too. Invalid conclusions. Consistent with this is one of the words we've heard forever and ever. And I had been saying we should take it off the forms. Nobody listens to me. 15 years later, they did take it off the forms let's see, I was writing for that book. So 2019, and they finally did take it off. Consistent with the history. Here's what I would say in court, and I was kind of joking with Sela about this a little bit earlier and being a hard nose, but the question is the exam consistent with the history? You can check that box, or you can check a box that says the exam is inconsistent with the history. Well, how do I know? I don't know that. And that's why I don't like to answer that question. In fact, I quit answering it after a while. However, what I would answer is that, yes, it could be consistent with the history. It also could be consistent with something other than the history. And sometimes attorneys don't like to hear that kind of language, but that's the truth. So that's what we want to do. There were also, they finally did take that off the form in March of 2018. And one of the other things that was on the form that may still be there, I don't know, but it says list your assault related findings. Well, I don't know that. If I see a bruise on your hip, I don't know if someone struck you or if you fell down in your corral or at your house. So these are some of the vocabulary words that I object to along the way. Evidence of sexual assault. Yeah, there may be evidence of sexual contact. There may be evidence of penetration, but there's no evidence of sexual assault. Sexual assault by history, what does that mean? That means someone told me that there was a sexual assault. So there are some invalid conclusions that if you bring them to a jury or you bring them to someone else, they may come to the wrong conclusion based on what you have said. What if there are no findings? Oh my gosh. Okay, this all has to do with age, history, activity, perception, normal variance, hygiene, medical findings, prior contact. The rape shield law comes into play a little bit because sometimes it's not understood exactly. When I do my examination, I want to know if the patient had sex within 5 to 10 days before the examination, because if there are, sex is the act of two bodies rubbing together, and that can cause abrasions and stretching injuries called tears. And so when those things happen, that doesn't immediately mean that there was a sexual assault. Those are naturally occurring things. So that's what we want to find. That's why we want to find out if there was sex with anyone else, or even the same person. If you had one nice sexual encounter with your husband and then a not so nice one, we want to know that. So that's why I say medical find or prior contact, and the time between the event and the exam. If you're coming in 24 hours or 2 hours or 5 days, likely we're going to see some evidence of that particular event. But if you're far beyond that, in a week or 2 weeks, I actually saw a patient years, and we're not going to find, we might be able to find something, but we won't be able to date it back to a particular event. So cooperation, this is another issue that sometimes people have trouble with. They think that if you're going to be sexually assaulted, you're going to have injuries all over the place. But if I think that you're going to hit me or hurt me or shoot me or stab me, I'm going to cooperate with you. And that is going to help me avoid injury. So then we discussed already the acute versus non-acute and pubertal versus prepubertal. So no matter what you hear, there are a lot of brochures out and there's a lot of care groups that want to help you. But sometimes they say things that prevent people from coming in for an examination. For example, if they say, come for an examination, but don't take a shower if you've been assaulted, and don't change your clothes. Listen, if you take a shower and change your clothes, come in anyway. Don't let that stop you. The information that you're trying to give you is good information, but we have good technology now too. And I still might be able to pull some, if we're within the possibility of the time frame, I might be able to pull some DNA evidence off of my patient. And don't forget that if the patient has the suspect's DNA on them, the suspect might have the patient's DNA on them. So law enforcement often brings the suspect in as well, and I'll do that exam. If I know about it, I'll do it first because it's shorter. But again, we want to be careful. Do come for an exam, even if it's been a few days or more. I've heard people say, well, my mom told me that it was too late. No, it's not too late. Come in. One of the reasons is not only are we going to possibly do the exam on you and depending on the time frame, collect samples, but we're going to also get you in for a lot of different services that you may need. So besides the counseling, the advocate is going to offer counseling. Used to be 10 free sessions here. I'm not sure what they have anymore for LaCock. The services can be far-reaching. So I do advise go ahead and get involved in that. And so even if you're doing what you shouldn't have done, let's say you sneak out. I know this never happens to anybody, but like if you sneak out at night and something bad happens to you, sometimes you feel like you want to hold that in and not tell anybody, but really for the best of everyone, it's a good idea that you do tell and you do come in for an examination. We don't know. Sometimes we identify a lot of people that do this kind of thing to a lot of different people, and that's how we can string them together sometimes. So you can think of a couple of other good reasons that maybe you shouldn't come in, but fight with yourself and come in if you can. So one thing is that not everyone is forthcoming. And I like this picture because there's a lot of these, and especially if you like the home video stuff. Did you get into the chocolate? No, I didn't. I have some good relationships with some very interesting child researchers, and some of the things that they come up with is really extraordinary. And you think kids don't lie? Yes, again. It's not our role to believe or not to believe the patient history. My role is to completely and objectively document the medical and forensic history and collect samples and provide prophylaxis resources and referrals. We want to, on the discharge, we want to list the advocate so the patient can stay in touch with the advocate. We also provide the patient for prophylaxis to prevent sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy. And that's a part of the examination. So that's what we do. Oh, well, here we are at the end of one.